Hello, can I be heard and can I be seen? Just confirming.
Yes, you were audible and visible.
Thank you. If there are any POIs, you can just raise it through voice and I'll make sure to take you. Pronouns are he, him. All right. Speech starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ladies and gentlemen, two things from my speech. Firstly, how only on our side do you allow for the growth of a stronger shared identity within the LGBTQ community? And secondly, why only on our side do you bring development and success to the areas that opt into this tourism? 5 pieces of framing prior to entering my constructive. Firstly, what is exclusive to both sides? You're gonna be accepting of people to places that are generally considered as safe, so they will still be able to go to things like the typically very popular gay bars in BGC, for instance, and stuff like that, and the very popular places in Atlanta, whatever. But secondly, in terms of what is going to be exclusive in opposition, they will only be going to places that are well known and are traditionally associated with LGBT spots, like your bars and like your gay districts. On government, therefore, it has to be very clear. On our side, you will be focusing a lot on local and indigenous forms of queerness. So this looks like gay-owned restaurants and cafes that are small, that don't have franchises or look like Mayora in Katipunan Avenue, like the Babaylans, for instance, up north in Banawe. So these places are historically rich and relevant, and have inclusive practices that are still upheld to this very day after hundreds and thousands of years. But also that these places are culturally unconventional. So understand that these places are not found on things like, not currently yet found on things like Instagram or stuff like Google Maps. But also is that understand the mechanism in that the preset tour guides will educate people on the culture, so they won't just play the culture of these specific places. Obviously, they won't bring you just the malls, right? But lastly, is that you're gonna promote this true and rich culture as the unique selling point to be able to make this area prosper. What does the LGBT movement explicitly want on our side? Obviously, you want to identify a problem. You want to be able to mobilize and reach this goal, and also prove that there's a historical bearing to queerness. Disproving the radical idea that queerness is something that's new and something that is only prospered in the early 2010s or something like that. But thirdly, is that in terms of the types of tourists you're likely to get on our side, they're likely to be people who are younger in general. They're going to be very demure and very mindful and very caring, because obviously these are individuals who have been oppressed for hundreds of years. They don't want to express the same kabastusan that was imposed onto them by oppressive individuals to the people who they're going to and welcoming them. So understand, generally, these people who are LGBT are probably some of the most compassionate and understanding individuals you're likely to meet. But also is that understand, most importantly, that their enthusiasm levels are likely to be the highest, because obviously the history and multifaceted, like the rich diversity of the LGBT is not very well known. So presumably they want to learn more about the diversity of queerness and how it is made. But lastly, understand that we do not expect these tourism we do not expect this tourism to be imposed onto these areas. So obviously we will only be bringing tourists to areas wherein locals consent. So to tourists coming in and wherein agreements are made as to how tourists can both enjoy and learn and spend their money and enjoy, and also how these locales can grow. So obviously, if locals don't want tourists to go, obviously tour guides will not bring them there, and the government won't allow that. But lastly, is that obviously just in like intuitively, tour guides won't bring to places where they receive a no or no consent at all, because obviously tourists will have a very bad experience, will cause conflict, it will leave a very bad taste. Tourists won't opt into that again. Before I go on to my first argument, sure, go ahead.
What is the interest of this community that wants to invite other people to visit their country?
Yeah, I'll talk about my second argument that directly responds to your POI. Firstly, in terms of a shared identity, in terms of how you're able to foster this only exclusively on our side. You are able to get educated to unconventional queer practices, queer cultures, and queer individuals. Firstly, it reinforces the idea that there is no set stringent rule set as to how exactly one queer individual must be. So it eliminates the narrative that there are only a handful of types of gay individuals. So it emphasizes things like diversity, the different ways, for instance, that people can practice their queerness, even if driving home the point that even if you are extremely different to the people around you, that is okay in terms of how you express your sexuality and your love, etc. But thirdly, is that it allows you to be empathetic because of the things like the shared history, understanding the justice that still needs to be served and to underserved and oppressed individuals, etc. This is particularly important for two reasons. Firstly, is that there is no other mechanism to education that will highlight that highlights the lives and experiences of these individuals. So obviously, it's unlikely for them to get funding from the state because even if they are okay with you being gay, you're at the end of the day very far away in these areas and too small to even care about. But secondly, is that you just don't have a lot of opt-in from customers or people coming by to these opportunities because obviously it's fluctuating and because you're geographically far. The second was in terms of success and developments to the areas that opt into these. Firstly, it is very hard to understand in terms of context and the response to Ben, that it's very hard for you to find success as a gay individual right now because obviously you're going to be shunned by your family, removed from your job or overlooked by the government, or for example, even if you are not, you're also geographically far. This leads to a lot of people just feeling generally overlooked or generally feeling oppressed. Some individuals are okay with this, therefore you probably won't go to these places, right? But most of the time, individuals want to grow because obviously when you attain levels of financial and commercial success, you are able to attain your basic needs and stuff like that. And obviously you want to grow whatever culture and whatever business you have, right? So the only place where you find this opportunity right now is in your locale because of the surrounding conservative cultures that exist outside of it. So as an individual who lives in a very far away LGBT safe haven, for example, in Banawe, it's very difficult for you to go to somewhere that is far more conservative down south. The reason as to why this is important is because, firstly, when you opt in, you consent to more people coming in and you're able to bring more successfully. More volume of people coming into this area, be it a coffee shop or a shack in the mountains of Banawe, etc. But you also get more business, more people purchasing your products, opting into your services, sleeping to your hotels and shows and stuff like that. Obviously, all of on top of an impact of a richer culture. But secondly, you become more public. You grow on things like social media. You have greater levels of attention, but we would suggest that this can be sustained because LGBT individuals are generally the most super loyal individuals you will find. This is particularly important debate winning for two reasons. Firstly, you are able as an individual and locale able to attain the needs and the stuff that you never want, that you were never and you were deprived in opportunities you were deprived of before. But more importantly is that at the very worst, while it is like for some individuals, like what Ben will tell you coming in, something that they don't want to opt into, at the very worst, that is the worst case. At the very best, I think it's principally okay that we give all of these individuals the options. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that speech, calling on Leader of the Opposition to open the case for side opposition. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yes, loud and clear.
Great, thank you. For POIs, raise your hand via Zoom or turn on your camera. That would be great. When the LGBT movement prefers the imagery of the dead over the tireless efforts of their current members of the movement to create a community that is safe and inviting for people on the ground, we think that it's not only invalidating to the efforts that our community has made, but it's also misleading to the people who we want to invite. I only have one extraneous rebuttal against Johan in this debate, and that is why unity is less likely to happen on Gov. Because their main mechanism is that the shared history of indigenous identities, such as Babaylans, for example, in the Philippines, is one that is likely to create consensus among the different members of our community to unite them under a shared image. The first is, this is untrue. The process of collecting historical accounts for these indigenous identities is one that's already regionally biased. Talk about, for example, the Laguna copper plate inscription, not being able to talk about the accounts, for example, from Mindanao, or how the narrative of the Babaylans is one that is tied upon the empires that exist in Cebu. What that means is it's unlikely to be as inclusive as Johan thinks it is. It is likely to still be regionally motivated. But second is that these identities are are already often disputed in status quo anyway. There are discussions, for example, within the LGBTQ movement to say if it's exploitative for us to lean into the idea of the Babaylan, for example, or externally, where the church is trying to co-opt, for example, these kinds of certain things. So even if you agree that they may get like a shared identity, it's unlikely to be one that is efficient. But lastly, is that people simply do not relate with the history of these indigenous communities already. So even if you're a modern queer individual, you don't see how you personally relate to the Babaylans, for example, in their lived experiences. It's unlikely to be the best representation of you as an individual. Therefore, it's less likely to unite you as a community. The next thing that I want to then talk about is framing. What is the interest of this movement in the developing country, considering wanting to talk about queer tourism? And I want to be clear on what's different on both sides, because we think that on both sides of the debate, you're likely to indulge in queer tourism. The question is about what strategy, what flavor of queer tourism do you see is more effective and more representative of your current community? Is it on government, where you try to highlight indigenous flavors that people no longer relate to, or on our world, where you're more likely to highlight modern efforts to create safe communities and safe spaces so that people are likely to be invited to your country? One is that you're likely you want to invite foreign queers to visit your country. So things like you want to prop up and support queer businesses and providing safe spaces for people on the ground. And note that the Delta on their world, because they want to highlight the indigenous aspects of that community or of that country, it is likely that these businesses are going to shift their business model to one that is likely to be more indigenous. So a gay bar in BGC is likely to rebrand themselves as the Babaylan Bar, for example, and sell drinks called like, I don't know, agimat or like whatever, right? That is the kind of adjustment that these queer businesses have to make, or else they risk failing. They give up on their own identity. I'll talk to you later. Next is, I want to talk about the kinds of people who are likely to buy into queer tourism, because I think Johan already loses his debate the moment that they don't talk about this. We think that these individuals are likely to be taste seekers. They want to see what are the different flavors of the LGBTQ community in the countries that they visit. They might argue competition, but we say that even if London is a safe space for queer people, tourists aren't likely to visit London on summer, spring, fall, and like, I don't know, winter, right? We say that there's still an active opportunity for us to compete with other countries that are similar to us, and we say that that's the competitive edge of us, you know, like highlighting our community. So the primordial interest of these individuals are safety. Where do you not get imprisoned? But second, where do you not get shunned? So the legal and social aspects are more important. But next is, what is the actual lived experience of you visiting your country? So when you visit the Philippines, what is likely to be the queer experience for you? Who are the kinds of people that you're going to mingle? And it's less likely to be an educational discussion, because if they want to care about the nerds who care about history, we think that on both instances those are accessible. What matters is the strategy of what we put forward above the line marketing. Joseph, you know this as a marketing individual. The trade-off then is, on our world, we're okay if people are not as well versed with the cultural nuances of our own country, because we say that what's more important is forwarding the experiences that are likely to be relatable to them, in as much as we're trying to change their consumer mindset to one where they're more likely to visit our country in comparison to other countries. POI, yes, Aki.
You don't need to personally relate to history for it to be meaningful to you. Maybe I have no connection to comfort women, but I can still empathize with them.
Yes, but comfort women is a visceral topic. Like, you can't just use that example. You cannot relate to the Babaylan in as much as how I cannot relate, for example, to Igor Rots because I'm Tausug. Like, that's the precise cultural nuance of you not being able to relate to something. Like, my God. First argument, modern flavors of queer tourism is more likely to attract more people to come into your country. And there are four careful premises here in this argument. The first is that the movement has not related or have modernized indigenous identity to fit their current identity. One is this is probably because of things beyond your control. So for example, things like colonialism, separating indigenous identity with the identity that you currently experience. That is why when UP Diliman changed their street signs into baybayin, like, we don't use baybayin, right? That's just a cultural signifying mark for them to show that they're indigenous. We say that on their world, it's likely that those shifts are more prominent. But second is that you have like the members of the movement themselves do not know the full grasp of these cultural idiosyncrasies, right? So you might know what the Babaylan is, but you don't know how they live. You don't know how they relate to you as an individual. But third is that in the instances where these depictions are problematic, talk about how the Hijras in India, for example, was a Hindu, like was like a Hindu religious figure where people want to relate to them, but they're not religious. We say that on those aspects, we have modernized them into more modern flavors or more representative of our lived experiences, like the Kathoeys in Thailand, which are the modern ladyboys, right, that we're currently experiencing now. What this means is, on their world, you betray the movement by not depicting them as they are. Comparatively, on our world, the counterfactual shows them more actionable depictions that appeal to the sensibilities of these tourists. Things such as safety, things such as what is the likely experience that they're going to get when they mingle with the members of the LGBTQ community. What do the drag shows look like? What do the pageants look like? What are options for buying for fashion? These things tie back to what the tourists look for in a holiday getaway, and therefore they're more likely to believe and go to our country. Next thing, then, right, on highlighting the movement's current efforts that respects the movement more. The first is you dignify the current efforts, because we say that's an effort because it's a painstaking process to make your community safer. And we say that as the community, you're interested in highlighting the current efforts that your movement is currently doing to make your community more safe. You glamorize current narratives of business owners who are trying to appeal to queer individuals by giving them safe spaces, of fashionistas, for example, who are creating their boutique stores, for example, to create a uniquely local twist to the LGBTQ experience, are people that we significantly highlight on our world because it's them being them, it's their BAU, and that's what we want to highlight. Why is this important to the interest of the movement then? First is that you tip it to more tourists. So if you care about tourists, you win on our world. Second is relatability. But lastly is you show the narratives of your current movement. And if you care about highlighting and promoting your members of the movement, it is more achieved on side opposition. Very, very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech calling DPM to forward the case for side government. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I both visible and audible?
Can you try saying some stuff just to be sure?
Read the motion.
Very classy, very demure.
Okay, I guess you do.
Yes, can hear. All good.
Okay. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Queer people have been here even before the arrival of the Spaniards. Oftentimes, people forget the hidden stories of local and indigenous queerness because status quo is already saturated by mainstream and conventional queerness. RuPaul's Drag Race, saying Yes Queen Very Demure, participating in Brat Summer. These are the leading manifestations of the queer identity that reach people right now as children and even as they grow into adolescents. This is the most important problem in debate because for the queer individual, they are detached from the roots of their queer identity, which is an important part of their history. But secondly, the local and indigenous queers have played a major role in getting the movement to where they are now, so it is just morally disgusting that they are being forgotten in current society. If leader of opposition believes that people do not know these kinds of queers and cannot relate to them, and so they give them up because they're simply unprofitable, then for one, you lose the purpose of you as a movement to help the vulnerable and necessarily tie back to the generations of the people who did their part in getting your movement to where they are now. But secondly, you lose a part of the history for queer people, which is a piece of history that queer people have always wanted to know and deserve to know in the first place. Before I pursue my extension, let's go to the responses. The first thing they say is that it's invalidating to current efforts. Chair, the premium is already put on the current efforts. So other people still glamorize boutiques. There are still gay bars in Malate. They still support RuPaul's Drag Race. There are already a lot of narratives that force you to put the premium on modern current efforts. So the problem of them being forgotten, being validated is probably unlikely. But secondly, the people that are invalidated are the roots of queer history, the local and indigenous people who probably sacrifice a lot to be able to allow the movement to be more conventional or to be more modern right now. So if we're talking about invalidation, oftentimes these local people are the people that have been invalidated for the longest time. And so if you want to help them, you necessarily do that by making them sustainable, making sure that they're able to get some form of empowerment. The second thing I want to respond to is the problem of co-opting the local identity. Chair, that's already the problem.
People right now are already appropriating the Babaylans. People right now are already appropriating ballroom culture. So, if the problem is misrepresentation, we give local queers the power to speak up and reclaim their identity. Because once they become more well known to queer tourism because of the prioritization, they have that moral capacity, or they have that more social capital to be able to speak up and call out people. But you hear from Johan clearly that you get more education on these things. So even if these kinds of big establishments do appropriate the other cultures, there are probably a lot more people who are more educated now who are willing to call you out when you appropriate Babaylan culture and be able to make sure it's more consistent to who these queers that are in local and indigenous areas are. Before we proceed to the extension, let's take a POI from Ben. Sure.
Why is queer tourism the tipping point for queer history? Because you're dying on a weird hill.
Yeah, that's the extension. It is a shot at empowering local indigenous forms of queerness. Firstly, for indigenous communities, they are probably a dying culture because of things like globalization and how this identity may not be the best mechanism to empower yourself financially. The Babaylans are forced to constantly negotiate their identity to gain money to feed for their families, so they probably give up their identities in order to get other forms of financial means. Secondly, for local queerness then in developing countries primarily, oftentimes they live in areas that are to some extent still conservative. And that's true because the nuance of developing countries are three things. One, oftentimes they're not welcoming of Western ideals like queerness. Two, they're probably led by other structures like religion, like Catholicism. Three, they're a minority group still. So in terms of the numbers game, they still have less social capital. So then, these local people still long for acceptance and belongingness, which is hard for them to achieve, especially if they live in the province, especially if they live in a developing country that are oftentimes still a lot more conservative. These two exclusive problems then are the most important to consider because these two sectors are the most vulnerable, and it is like simply the role of the LGBTQ movement to help the vulnerable. But how do we do this? Through queer tourism. The first to say that it becomes a sustainable form of livelihood for indigenous people because we educate people and attract tourists. And this is likely because of the general characteristics of a tourist, where one, they often travel to experience niche things. That is why they travel in the first place, because they're already bored with how things are happening in their own country. That's why they go to the Philippines, the Babaylans. Two, they can get drag queens and conventional queerness in their home country. So if there's already a gay bar in US, for example, you wouldn't probably want to still go to a gay bar in the Philippines because you've already experienced that and you can get that anywhere else. But three, they are queer. So probably they have that incentive to get solace in the history of other queer people and the people that came before them. This means that it is likely that tourists would go to these areas funded by the movement as a safe space, and they'll be able to get money through their cultural practices. So when tourists go to their areas and be able to learn from them and be able to worship in the same way that the Babaylans worship, for example, that is already a way for the Babaylans to get some form of money or some form of financial compensation to be able to get more empowerment and be able to buy food on the table. Moreover, I'd like to be very clear. Opposition might say that this commercialization may lead to losing your identity. We think this is unlikely because of three reasons. One, it already came from Johan. It only applies to communities that give you consent. So they won't be forced if they do not want to participate in these kinds of tourism. So people from the communities, for example, are always going to be part and will always lead the development of these queer spaces simply because they are the people you want to cater to. Secondly, your niche is your unique selling point. So you have that strong incentive to preserve it and make it free from external factors that necessarily drastically change it. So tourists adjust to the community and not the other way around. But thirdly, even if other businesses arise, oftentimes these are probably establishments also owned by queer owners. So probably they are incentivized to be sensitive because they know how it is. They know how it is to have your identity taken from you. So even if they build their queer establishments near these indigenous areas, they have that moral respect to be able to make sure that these kinds of cultural preservations are necessarily preserved. But two things that another thing then, you make safe spaces for local queerness. I already told you, oftentimes in the province, especially in developing countries, these kinds of areas are still probably more conservative. So at least in our side, when you do prioritize the queerness in local areas, the prerequisite then to the movement is to be able to assure everyone's safety. So just necessarily, you make it more safe for local queers living in the province and living in local areas, simply because you make it a gay district, for example, and you allow these people to believe and necessarily create initiatives to make sure they're a safe space. What are the impacts from this speech? Two things. One, you get identity preservation because you necessarily educate people and you allow indigenous communities to be able to reclaim their identity. If they're already being appropriated right now, they need a lot of social capital to be able to raise up and speak for themselves. You get that when you give them the money to do so, and the social the recognition you can get from social media, for example, and inviting tourists outside your country. But secondly, as a state, they'll probably be able to see your value because of how you help the community. So because how you help the economy. So when you help the economy, the state has an incentive to make it as safe as possible and fund your local initiatives. In the same way that in Japan, because there is a gay district and it's like more accessible and gives you money, you probably want to defend them as well. So for all those reasons, stand with the local and indigenous queers, stand with government side. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that speech, calling on DLO to forward the case of side opposition. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
I'll take PY's true voice. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I think that the problem of government is that they suggest that there are tourists that will still go to bars and still cater to established businesses in cities. The problem with this is that they do not defend as to how a lot of these tourists will know about these queer bars, on which businesses are likely to be queer owned or not, or people who are probably like businesses that looks queer but are actually owned by straight homophobic individuals. This co-opting that they do ignores the trade-off that their burden has to take. But more than that, right? They also do not solve the problem that they set. If Gov suggests that people forget, they do not, to no degree, right, tell us as to why going to the Banawe, going to Baguio is enough for you to remember and probably make up that history and put that towards your own identity. What we suggest is at least you're likely just do this as a band-aid to feel good. We don't think that that kind of education is likely to be genuine. But even if we engage the best extent of their frame, if we believe in the frame of Gov that perhaps there are still modern influences that pushes people towards cities, that pushes people towards modern bars in Manila, then what we suggest is that the manifestation of queer tourism on their side that uses local and IP forms of queerness happens in a way that commercializes and combats the modern forms of advertisements that also exist. This looks like, for example, the LGBTQ, precisely because they are beholden to market forces, that often there is no assurance that they will represent the fullest extent of that local queerness, precisely because not only do they, want to appeal to the tourists, but also because they are in competition with the modern advertisement if we believe that their frame is true. And therefore, you likely water down the existence of these queer local forms. It is you telling to the people in Banawe that you should not act like this, avoid practicing these kinds of activities because they might be turned off, because they probably will not come back. And therefore, we question to what degree can they actually manifest that education to which that they suggest. In fact, if we want to be educated, we think that queer tourism is probably not the best way for you to know the historical terms. And so for us, we believe coming from Ben that a lot of these experiences are often detailed, are often lost in the archives. We suggest that it's slightly better that you just don't go there and probably read in some degree. All right, that's the first one. The second thing and the second harm of this commercialization is that you also burden the localities to cater towards the tourists. This looks like, for example, Wang Od in the Banawe, where she was forced, for example, to tattoo 100 people a day with her 80-year-old frail body. So therefore, Gov's consent is a lie, because people don't just consent just because you ask them if they want to advertise themselves to the tourists, precisely because your messaging as the LGBTQ on their side manifests as something that shows that the benefit is way, way greater. It shows big money, it shows big development, it shows big jobs, and therefore it's likely that a lot of these tourists are these people in Banawe are going to be coerced to sell their culture to you, to coerce to appeal towards a lot of these tourists. And at the end of that, it just clearly shows how you harm the manifestation of that culture. It's either to show the culture to the lesser extent and therefore do not get education, but also you harm these individuals that lives in Banawe. The last thing that I will talk about in this part about empowerment and dying culture is just to ask, when do cultures die? Because cultures die the moment that they are not passed over and practiced anymore. It is unclear on their side why people and tourists will practice these cultures insofar as they are often passed down by blood. This looks like, for example, Wang Od's traditional traditional tattoo is only passed to her daughter and no one else, it is unclear why you give that to a white man who just visited you for 10 days. And therefore, you don't even preserve that dying culture that they want to access. The next thing that I'll talk about in this speech is why contemporary forms of queerness also invites tourists, and in fact, to a better degree. The first thing I would like to note is to disprove the frame that comes from their side when they suggest that, well, these indigenous forms of queerness is your only competitive edge. It is not true, precisely because a lot of developing countries that you also compete with also have these indigenous forms of queerness that you also will compete. Things such as the practices of indigenous queerness in Thailand, things such as the indigenous practices probably in Malaysia. And therefore, right, it's unclear to which degree that you are likely going to be competitive. Compare this on what we suggest on our side. We suggest that the contemporary forms of queerness is better because of how you are able to, how tourists are able to relate themselves towards the interpretation of that culture. And this is because even if we import international forms of queerness, it doesn't mean that they remain within that international standards, because you often tailor fit them towards the kinds of lived experiences that you have as a Filipino. This itself is good because that itself is a new thing, a novel reinterpretation of what they see in the US. They probably have not seen Mariana Summers dropping dead like multiple times in multiple higher blocks. We think that that is still something that is likely to be attractive for them. But more than that, we suggest that the use of contemporary forms is a more palatable invite to the incentive of tourists to be safe. If you look at the info slide, right, a lot of the incentive of a lot of these queer tourists are likely to be safe and to, visit a lot of these places, not to get educated. It is because when you market contemporary forms of queerness, you place them in cities and backgrounds of bars, in parades, in breakfast halls, in wide escapades of the cities. This is good because it's a messaging mechanism that, yes, this place is safe and it is a better place to be in, precisely because that's unlikely for me to get harmed on that country. Sure, the POI.
So how do you preserve the local queer identity?
So it doesn't matter because we think that the LGBTQ community has no inherent obligation towards a lot of these cultures that often are niche and are often in Banawe and do not participate within the community itself. What we suggest is that if a lot of these cultures would want to preserve, this also does not exist on your side precisely because you do commercialize them. In fact, perhaps it's better to leave them alone rather than to make them overwork for 10 hours. The last thing that I'll talk about is how they do not engage with the most unique harm that exists within this motion. What we suggest is that you focusing on indigenous forms of culture also forsakes the own member that you have. We give a lot of reasons from Ben as to why a lot of the lived experiences that you have as a person is different from the history that you have. This looks like, for example, us having different lived experiences because of the forces that we cannot control, such as globalization. On their side, you force your members to rebrand. You force your members to adapt a lot of this indigenous culture when the fact that they do not know about this. How should you weigh this in analysis? The first here is that you betray your members. Member loyalty is in fact the prerequisite for you to appreciate a lot of your values as the LGBTQ community. The moment that you do not protect them, you abandon them and they let you go. We think that this is a very, very big harm that they do not solve on their side.
Thank you for that speech calling on government whip. Hear, hear.
Hello. Hold on. You guys through voice. Okay. Three, two, one. the worst thing you hear from opposition is that they have no obligation to these people. Crucially, the movement has always been about a united struggle. You don't just protest to get your self-marriage. You don't risk your life just to get recognition for your own identity. We will never say that preserving culture and protecting the individuals who are smaller than you is something that isn't important. The first issue I want to talk to you about is where we get better shared identity. And this is important because it's the most proximate goal of the community. Realize that this is an actor analysis motion. This is the most important to them because it's not just your identity, it's also the identity of the people you love and the people who you're friends with, for example, who share that identity with you. One, the movement isn't depicted as they are, like what you hear in opposition, because they'll change for the tourists coming in, and this is why it's harmful, like you hear from Ben. The first question I want to ask is, what do tourists look for in like these areas, or what do tourists look for in general? Because they assert this, right? What we argue is that when any kind of tourist opt into any kind of like tourism package, it's precisely you want to go to Japan. The tourism packages always bring you to Mount Fuji. For example, when you want to go to the Philippines, it brings you to like the rice terraces. For example, it brings you to like Albay in Bicol. So we'd argue, yes, it is likely to be educational, even if it's not always educational discussions. It's always something for you to be immersed in. It's always a culture that you can immerse, that you can explore, because these aren't things that you have back at home. Crucially, the reason why people want to go outside of their own country is because they want to experience things that they can't experience in their own country. It's not the profitable, conventional gay bars that they assert, because crucially, foreigners in more liberal countries like London already know what it's like to be in a queer bar. What they want to experience is things like being in a small lesbian-owned cafe, for example, to be in the culture of the Babaylans, for example, and like know what it is about them. Crucially, the people that they talk about, the people who don't care about these small queer identities, people who don't care about the indigenous communities, these people who don't opt in aren't the people who the delta of this debate relies on. You get the biggest change from people who do care for these communities, the people who do care about the movement. Because if you get people who don't care about the movement and only want to experience the fun of gay bars, then you won't get the biggest change from them, because they probably won't fight for you. They probably don't care about your identity when that gets washed out. What we want is to protect these individuals, the people who the people who are the people that they're protecting in the opposition side are the people who can help you with that. The second question I want to talk to you about is, do they actually need to change to appeal to tourists? We say that no, because you are a compassionate individual when you're in this movement, very likely. These people opting in are people who go through more or less the same struggles as you. This is where you form empathy. When you have that understanding that they've also been through the same harm of like having the conservative parents, for example, that they can't necessarily come out to. So you understand these things, you're more likely to be a compassionate individual. Even if this is not true and not everybody's a compassionate individual, I'd argue that this is the minority of cases. They don't even prove to you why that resentment builds, or why it is likely that people won't be compassionate towards the people who they share a movement with, who they share an identity with. It's likely that they won't care about you on their side because precisely they already concede that they don't care about education. They don't care about being well-versed in the culture. This is where you get people who won't fight for you, people who don't care about your consent, etc. The second even if is that even if this still happens and there are people who aren't compassionate, they probably consent to these things the moment you start a business or open up your space to tourism. Crucially, there's always going to be bad customers. There's always going to be people who don't respect your identity. But you as a queer individual still opening that business in a conservative country or in a less developed country, you cannot rid the world of bad customers. Your biggest interest then, probably at the time, is things like profit. These are the things that matter to you, and these are the things that you want to achieve because you're willing to take those risks. You're willing to put out your identity out there just because you want this money. This is important because we'd say that it's important then to give these people that success, to give these people the likelihood that they can get money, they can get a return for this if that's their most proximate interest at the time. Crucially, money is important for you to self-actualize. You need to be in a space where you can be safe. You need to be in a space where you can talk to people. You can't necessarily do that when you're in a conservative country, when you're in a developing country. But two, it's easier for you to protect yourself when you have these things like profit, because you have money and you don't need to rely on fundings from institutions that don't like you, like the state, for example. So you have your own means of like funding yourself. You have the own means of self-actualization under our side. So it's not always true that money isn't the most important thing, or it's not always true that these people don't want money, because this is where you get them self-actualization in the future. So crucially, all of this proves is why they can't necessarily assert that tourists don't want to educate themselves, that tourists don't really see the need for cultural like immersion. Before I move on, you.
By the end of this debate, it is still unclear from side government why indigenous tourism is likely to be more successful than the tourism on op.
Well, what we're saying is tourists probably want to experience something they haven't experienced before. So what you're going for in opposition or things are like more fun things, which they can probably experience anywhere else, right? You have no unique selling point for these things, so it's unlikely that they'll opt into tourism if that's your case. So the second question is, why does it have to be queer tourism? Like specifically, for one, these are conservative areas, meaning it's hard to self-actualize and be successful, as Yash illustrates this very clearly. So you can't rely on other means with your country, for example, to get money, for example, to get resources for you to do these things. But two, it's your identity dying when it gets misrepresented by foreigners, as you hear from me as well. Crucially, they say at LO, they don't care about education. Okay with being well versed in the culture. This is bad because this is where you let more powerful people like the foreigners, for example, recreate that narrative. What we need is to what we necessarily need is to cement that identity, is to tell people that we've existed way before the modern idea of gayness even came out. These are the things that you need to cement, and these are the things that you open up to the public for misrepresentation when you don't necessarily immerse them in that culture. Why do we keep this culture under our side? We have consent under our side. Crucially, it's not comparable to people like Wang Od, for example, because the audience is very different. What we're saying is it's gay individuals opting in to experience the other the businesses or the lives of other gay individuals. These are people who are likely to be compassionate, people who are likely to be empathetic because they have the same experiences as you. Ben says in the response to the POI, I can compare myself to comfort women because I don't have that same experiences. But gay people do. They have the same movement. They probably went through the same things. So these are things that matter to them. Crucially, there's no other alternative for preserving culture. This is why when we POI, how do they preserve culture on their side? They don't even give you an answer. This is the most important thing because these people are the most vulnerable. They have no other means of self-sustaining themselves. They have no other means of being protected by the state, being protected by even the people within their community. We say it's horrible that if these people can't rely on the state, they can't rely on regular customers opting into their business, they can't even rely on their own community.
Thank you for that speech. Now calling opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Okay, am I audible and visible?
Yes, all good.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Yes, this is an actor's motion, but it is also a context-specific motion in the context of queer tourism. Therefore, the question of this speech should be, what should be the priority of the movement in the context of queer tourism? Government says that we have to cater to our members who probably want a shared identity and would want to reconnect with their indigenous roots. In opposition, we say that the biggest priority should be tourists and how we get them. First, why is the priority actor of government important? Firstly, they don't prove why a vast majority of tourists want to be educated. We explained down the bench why there are a lot of reasons why tourists would want to go to a certain place. Things like, I don't know, the entertainment. There are certain cutesy demi gays who just want to go to a pool in Boracay and spend the night in gay bar there. Often a lot of these tourists don't want to be re-educated. At best, some of them might be, but government does not explain to us why the vast majority of them are, which means that a lot of the local businesses operate on a lot of uncertainty as to their prospective market. But secondly, if it is members wanting reconnection, they don't explain why queer tourism has to be the avenue and the tipping point to get this form of reconnection. That can happen on our side still through things like reading through the internet about possible Babaylans or going through the academy and going through your resident local library to learn about these things. I would suggest that these avenues are far more likely to represent the authenticity of these actual cultures, because as Leah explains, education through queer tourism is often marred because of the process of commercialization. Why then are tourists more important? I want to focus then on tourists and what are the responses that government gives to you as to dispel them to dispel their importance. Government whip says that there are a lot of gay bars in London anyway, and that we don't allow them to differentiate themselves. Firstly, but the experience of a gay bar in London is vastly different from an experience of a gay bar in India and the Philippines. There are certain cultural nuances in the Philippines and India that are not present in London, which means that there is still an incentive for gay individuals to go into a gay bar in the PH, even if they have a gay bar in London themselves. In tuition pump, you will go to a gay bar in the Philippines because there is the white sanded beach Boracay. There are probably exotic drinks as well there that are not in London. But secondly, even if there are other gay bars in the world, there are very few of these safe spaces, which means that naturally you can't go back to London and London every time. It's just an art of the house, you will have a natural consequence of going to other places as well because you've grown tired of London, even if there is a gay bar there and you want to, like, I don't know, broaden your horizons. But secondly, government whip says that, well, we want to showcase our shared struggles in these queer tourist spots. Problem, they don't explain why this is exclusive. Firstly, you can tell this through the retelling of modern day drag bars. Oftentimes, a lot of drag artists use their shared oppression of like bullying and being closeted as their inspiration for doing a drag performance. So sharing shared struggles is not really an exclusive benefit that government can get. But secondly, local store owners, for example, can talk to their customers and share their story of how they got bullied as a child, but now I'm successful. So here I am. PO, I go.
I'm confused. You say the reason why they want to go to a gay bar in the Philippines instead of a gay bar in their own country is because of specific cultural nuances. So you agree that culture is important?
Yeah, you talk about specific cultural nuance. You misrepresent it, right? You on your side, you specifically focus on indigenous local culture that you haven't proven yet to be relevant to the average individual gay person. What we explain on our side is that while we do use cultural nuances, these are modern day cultural nuances that are more likely to be relatable. So things like, I don't know, gay lingo that a lot of foreigners would want to know and be versed with, right? What is the comparative? Government does not reply to how commercialization washes out the horrible visceral parts of indigenous people's culture. Leah forwards two comparatives. Firstly, that it's likely that their word is likely only going to focus on the good parts of like the Babaylans story. This is bad because if it's only the good parts, why would then foreigners go there if it's just any happy retelling story? But secondly, it is easier to whitewash history therefore if it is only good parts because that is what foreigners will tell them to their friends in their home country. But secondly, if they do strike a balance of good and bad retellings of these forms of history in like the Babaylan, for example, what next? At best, they tell these stories to their individuals, but it comes at the cost of re-traumatizing them. If we believe their characterization that people feel very strongly about these things, which becomes then a disincentive for them to further visit the place anymore in the future. So you re-traumatize and that becomes a deterrent for them to visit. But secondly, even if you do educate them, what then? It ends at that and still arrives at the same conclusion of you going to the library and reading up on these things. So all of this just to shows that there is no exclusive benefit in government. It's unclear why the passageway of free education should go through the vehicle of queer tourism. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is, does the average queer individual tourist feel a need to reconnect with their indigenous roots? Not that government just asserts that people would want to revisit. We explained from Ben that oftentimes modern forms are more appealing to the vast majority of individuals because a lot of these individuals have distanced themselves from their indigenous roots because of time, because they've forgotten, because these sorts of, I don't know, like materials are not accessible at that point in time when they were growing up. They can't say at DPM that, well, people already consume modern interpretations of indigenous queerness like Babaylan, and therefore it's not as foreign anymore. Responses here is that, firstly, they can't defend reinterpretations of indigenous culture because that is already modern forms of it, but secondly, their burden is to defend indigenous culture as it happened in the past, because if they don't, it is unclear why they got their benefit of education. The last thing I'm going to talk about is, even if you don't buy the issue on like, does the average local gay individual value the reconnection? The next question that you have to adjudicate this debate on is, do LGBT movements in developing countries have the capacity to use local indigenous cultures as a form of tourism branding? The problem with government is that they simply assert that they have all of these information to represent the Babaylan culture well, but they're saying where they will get this information and whether they will be authentic themselves. Firstly, we explain that government says that they will use indigenous forms of culture, but there is often no accurate recollection of what these things can be because they have been through loss to time. But even if they do get some forms of historical texts, often it feels inauthentic to practice because it does not resonate anymore with their current lived experiences. What is the trade-off then? On our side of the house, we might lose out on a bit of free education, but there are other alternative avenues for it. Their trade-off is that you display some of the local business and queer owners, or at least use them to change their branding. This this is bad because oftentimes a lot of these queer owners rely on steady business sales. But on their side of the house, they have to go through a reshifting and a rebranding of their menu, for example, to be able to cater to the indigenous form of branding that the LGBTQ movement asserts on them. This is bad because if government wants to have shared identity, then it's unclear to me why the LGBTQ movement therefore becomes a safe space for a lot of these local businesses to thrive. Because at that point in time, they feel betrayed. They feel that their agency is being deterred, etc., and that is why they have fewer like individuals opting into the LGBTQ movement, if that is a characterization of government that government wants to run on. But secondly, propose.
Thank you for that speech calling on opposition reply.
Am I audible?
Yes, all good.
Okay, amazing. Side government cannot win this debate by simply advocating for the historical revival of indigenous identities, because that doesn't debate the tipping point. And this is the first observation that I'd like to make from this Gov team. They don't debate the tipping point. They argue that identity preservation and resurfacing of queer history is important. But the question that we already launched as early as leader of opposition is, why does it have to be in the tipping point of queer tourism in the first place, where one, your community does not care and cannot relate to queer identities, so it's unlikely that it's going to be promoted well, but also where better alternatives are accessible on both ends of the debate. Things like the academe, things like media, things like the internet are probably better avenues for you to do things like revival of queer history. At the end of the debate, it is still unclear why does it have to be in the instance of queer tourism, because what that means is supporting indigenous identities does not give Gov the win, but their inability to fulfill the burden on talking about why this is the most successful strategy for the community to invite tourists makes them lose and makes Op win. Not just win, but win by a huge margin. But the second observation that I'd like to make on Gov is that they try to co-opt everything without any meaningful trade-off. They say, we still get to support queer businesses on our world because people care about modern depictions. But we already argued from as early as LO and even DLO extensively as to why they cannot be greedy with the benefits that exist in this debate. They cannot claim the benefits of modern queerness. They cannot claim the benefits of gay bars, precisely because of three reasons that we told you. One is because you inherently have to make a meaningful trade-off on the exposure that you give to the narratives and the businesses on modern queerness, precisely because you prioritize indigenous queerness. So you have to agree that there has to be some level of erasure where people do not know which spots to go, which shows to watch, and which people to follow on Instagram. But second is that in the process of indigenization, they just say, oh, you're going to be respectful. But in the business-minded individual, where you need to win the market in order for you to survive, you have to bite into the zeitgeist. You have to shift to an indigenous approach, or else you perish, right? But lastly, the idea of queer resentment on the event that you prioritize the indigenous community, which they didn't prove to be central to the movement in comparison to the current members of the community. You're likely to boil things like resentment, where people don't feel represented in the way in which you promote tourism in your country. I want to then weigh in the one important issue in this debate, which is which side is more successful in getting tourists. Because note, things like preservation, things like queer identities are non-issues in this debate, in as much as I've already proven to you why it's inexclusive and why it's worse, because this shouldn't be the tipping point. The Gov best push is, they say that the unique identity of the indigenous culture is likely to get interest towards tourists. One, and this is the main call-out that they already gave at Aki and across the bench, they don't prove the likelihood of success on why people are likely to be interested in these indigenous identities in the first place, in as much as these people only care about having a weekend getaway or meeting fellow queers, for example, in a certain area. It is unclear why that's a more successful strategy on their end. But the second question that I launched is, if people cannot relate to this culture, who is going to promote it? Why is it going to be promoted well? Especially if they want to argue the counterfactual of the local community promoting itself, why is that likely to be successful? But the third is that they simply assume that the experiences that we give in modern queerness are similar. They give you the intuition pop of gay bars, but like, I come from the beaches of Zamboanga and I've seen the beaches of Dumaguete, and I'm still excited to see the beaches of Thailand next month, right? It's not just a weird mechanism coming from them, but we said that it's not. It's our own version and our own unique narratives that we forward in the counterfactual. Things is like our own spins on culture, our own lived culture that we currently experience versus indigenous culture that is more foreign to people on the ground. So we have two independent paths of victory here. First is sensibilities and experience, which taps into the mind of the average tourist, but also representing the members of the community, which fulfills the burden of looking into the interest of the movement. At best, because this is important, because this is a debate about strategy, on their end, they introduce a new product by not bundling it with the hero item. They just give new products with new products. We give a more pervasive strategy to actually tip people to visit our country. Proud to oppose. Clear.
Thank you for that speech calling on government reply. Hear, hear.
Hello, can you hear me and see me?
Yep, audible, visible.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. It came from the deputy leader of opposition. The local queer identity does not matter. Excuse me. The Babaylans gave healing to the Filipinos. The Babaylans proved that you have queer identities in the Philippines, especially from years before. They are a symbol of who we are and why we are fighting right now. As the LGBTQ movement, especially since this is an after analysis debate, to say that they do not matter is disgusting and against everything you stand for. From that claim alone, opposition deserves to lose. Let's take it speaker by speaker. Leader of opposition said 2 things. The first is that it's invalidating to current efforts. Again, current efforts are already prioritized right now because they are already conventional and mainstream, so the trade-off is justified. Moreover, Johan was very clear that queer people in general are simply sensitive, woke, and are connected to the gays that came before them. The prerequisite then to loyalty is remembering your history, because these people have worked so hard and sacrificed so much to get to the rights you are enjoying now. But secondly, they say it's on appropriation. This will still happen if we do not allow local and indigenous queer identities to have enough social capital to get them the power to speak for themselves. So there is no solvency in opposition. Gay bars will still keep appropriating the Babaylans mixtures in their names of their cocktails. At least in our side, we give this queer locals and indigenous people a fighting chance and actually more social capital to be able to reclaim their identity and say that, hey, this is how we do it, not like that. But secondly, even if these people still appropriate cultures, at least other people are already educated enough so they will call you out for the appropriation you did. In the same way that people dragged Anitra when she was snogging rather than actually voguing in RuPaul's Drag Race. So the rebranding case of opposition will also probably just not fly, because in our side, when people are more educated and you force them to be educated about these kinds of things, that they cannot necessarily deny the identities of these local queers, you probably don't want to get canceled, so you don't probably want to rebrand into appropriating them. So from the first exchange, we already addressed opposition's greatest harms. So from Johan alone, we already win. Deputy Leader of Opposition, they say that the harm is that people won't know where queer spaces are and what are the queer-owned establishments. This is context ignorant. People know that they can be in Malate alas 7 ng gabi. They know that the gay district in Japan exists, so they have an incentive to know about this because they're traveling. But secondly, this is where queer tourism becomes super important, because that's the benefit of education from Johan. We tell you who are the Babaylans, where do they worship, what are their traditions, and how do they look like. The initiatives that fund these educations already exist in queer tourism. There is no response from opposition how they cater to the education that they provide. But the second thing they say is that this is not enough to highlight history. This is a contradiction. They say they do not care about history, but they also want to highlight that to some extent because they also agree that history is important. So from that contradiction alone, you have to penalize them. But secondly, the only mechanism they give you is that just don't go there and read. This is not enough. People are already doing this, and yet these local queer identities are still forgotten and are still disenfranchised. They are still poor. They are still discriminated. So even if in our worst case, right, that they do not profit, at least we amplify the fact that these people exist and deserve your attention and protection through the queer tourism that we provide. Opposition whip. They say that tourists don't want to be educated. Check your notes. You already from Johan to me to Aki already engaged in this. But the second thing they say is that their main benefit is to get more tourists. The tourists they want won't help your community because the tourists they may have money, but they will probably still appropriate your culture and do not care about your history because that is the type of tourists they want to appeal to. In our side, the tourists we appeal to are the people that want to be educated, those that understand the queer struggles, those that actually naturally want to be able to relate to their history because for the longest time, they were deprived of such and they want to reclaim their identity. For all those reasons, opposition believes that people do not care about local and indigenous queer identities. We say that maybe they should. From that, government wins by a huge margin. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you for that debate. You may now virtually cross the house. I'll be back in a couple of minutes for the OA.